Well, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon, Dr. Peter.
Good afternoon, Raghbendra. I think everyone is here.
Okay, good.
And I think we can start the proceedings. This is being recorded, so if you don't like to be recorded, leave now. Or we will not use the recording without your permission. We will certainly give also a advance notice when we do publish it. I think Commodore will start the proceedings, and I'd like to hand over to Sujit Samada. Good morning, sir. How are you this afternoon?
Good morning, and thank you so much. You have had a very excellent response. I'm not going to take too much time. We just have an hour on this platform. So let me bring, first of all, the webinar to order. We have more than 60 participants and counting, I guess. And it's my first and pleasant duty to begin this seminar by first introducing Admiral Dhowan, who, as we know, was the 22nd Chief of the Naval Staff, and post-retirement, he was the Chairman of the National Maritime Foundation. He was also instrumental in drafting India's first national maritime policy in a comprehensive way. He has lectured across the world in different think tanks, and during his service career, he has spent many years pursuing the subject of maritime security, laws of the ocean, and generally how to improve the maritime ecosystem for the benefit of mankind. With this short introduction, may I now request Admiral Dhowan to make a short comments over the next 4 to 5 minutes, please. Admiral Dhowan, sir.
Thank you very much, Commodore Sujit, for those kind words of introduction. At the very outset, I would like to accord a very warm welcome to Dr. Peter, Professor Jha, Dr. Edwin, our eminent participants, maritime experts, environmentalists, and researchers from different parts of the world who have joined in across various time zones to be with us for the second webinar on the Global Maritime Accord Academy initiative to discuss the role that maritime law and legislation in the areas beyond national jurisdiction can play to save the oceans. The oceans today are literally in hot waters, with the sea surface temperatures soaring well beyond the recorded levels. At the same time, the sea levels are rising because of global boiling and erosion of the coastal areas are resulting, as well as sinking of low-lying islands. The shipping industry continues to spew about 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the environment. Deep seabed mining and acidification of the oceans are resulting in contamination of the natural marine habitat, as well as depletion in our biodiversity. Humankind continues to illegally overfish and also dump 13 million tons of plastic into the oceans every year. And if the current rate of depletion in fish stock and pollution continue, in a few decades from now, we will have more plastic in the ocean than fish. Humankind is somehow blind to the fact that oceans are essential to life on Earth. They are the suppliers of oxygen and provide us with 50% of our oxygen needs. I would like all of you to reflect on an important fact that every second breath we take comes from the oceans. They're also absorbers of carbon dioxide and silently absorb over 30% of the greenhouse gases. They're rich in oil, gas, and mineral resources and provide humanity with seafood and salt from the sea. The oceans are also a virtual heat sink which keep our blue planet, the Earth, cool. They are repositories of renewable sources of ocean energy and have emerged as the global economic highways for transit of over 80% of the world's trade. Today, the oceans are under severe threat due to indiscriminate pollution and contamination of the natural marine habitat, which has resulted in disruption in the weather patterns and an adverse impact of climate change on the oceans. The maritime domain is virtually in the eye of the storm, with large percentage of extreme climate conditions turning into natural disasters. The areas beyond national jurisdiction, or the high seas, comprise 65% of the ocean spaces and 95% of the Earth's habitat. However, this is one of the least protected areas on the planet, and it has been overexploited, plundered, and polluted by the need and greed of humankind under the garb of freedom of the seas and common heritage of mankind. Till recently, we did not have a single international treaty or legislation for governance in the areas beyond national jurisdiction. A few months ago, the member states at the United Nations have adopted an international treaty for preservation as well as protection of marine life and the biodiversity in the global commons. One of the objectives of our Global Maritime Accord is to promote legislation and governance in the areas beyond national jurisdiction. And the theme of the webinar today is actually an SOS call to see how maritime law and legislation in the areas beyond national jurisdiction can throw up some path-breaking suggestions and recommendations to save the oceans. The international treaty under the United Nations Convention on Law of the Seas is actually yet to be signed and ratified by the member states. And this provides a window of opportunity and revalidates our initiative to complement the treaty by drawing up a Global Maritime Accord and drafting an action plan to counter the detrimental impacts of global warming and climate change by leveraging the oceans. This treaty, which has been under the United Nations Convention on Law of the Seas, we will also have to see as to how this initiative of ours, which actually has the conservation, protection, as well as the sustainable development of the oceans at its core theme, is made to ensure that we provide protection, conservation, and sustainable development of the oceans with the overall vision to save the oceans for a safe Earth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Admiral Dhowan, sir, for that introductory remarks. It's now my pleasant duty to introduce to this audience the very well-known Professor Peter Droege, who's spanned an illustrious career across various disciplines. He's been an international expert on urban sustainability, and he's worked on policy, he's worked on management, transport, strategy, urban design, city and regional planning, and regional infrastructure development. His academic career stretches from the School of Architecture and Planning at the MIT in the US, position at the University of Tokyo, and also at the University of Sydney. He's also been a conjoint professor at Newcastle School of Architecture and Built Environmental Modeling Studies. Presently, he is a director of the LISD, and we must acknowledge his very, very, very notable contributions to the cause of the Global Maritime Accord. It's now my pleasant duty to request Dr. Droege to kindly make his opening remarks and then conduct the proceedings in his own inimitable style. Thank you, Dr. Droege. Please.
Thank you, Commodore. I'm honored to be here, and I'd like to just extend my thanks to Admiral Dhowan and yourself and SAMDeS to initiate this journal, this Global Maritime Accord, and the Academy which we constructed together, which is in fact today in its second session, is an informal initiative with a formal objective to rally the support of all of you to build a practical, practice-oriented research and teaching environment around the GMA, and to invite you all today, especially the speakers today, to join our virtual faculty. And there could be no more better placed individuals than we have today, particularly Raghbendra from Canberra. You're in Canberra, sir, aren't you?
Yes. I'm in Canberra.
Very good. Okay, hello. And Edwin Egede from Cardiff. I will introduce the two experts a little more in a second. But we also have from Nagasaki, Professor Kawamura, and from Chennai, the excellent student of Sai University, Garima Singh, who will comment or expand on or challenge the two speakers. Now, speaking of the GMA and speaking of the pressures undergoing our oceans, one tends to talk about climate change, one thinks about waste, pollution, and all the direct impacts we have. But the most fundamental driver, of course, is our economic system, or helps in a way that will add to the detrimental nature of the pressures experienced by the oceans and our global environmental system. So it's very appropriate that the Emeritus Professor of Economics at the ANU, Raghbendra, will speak about that. His work is primarily in the area of public economics, environmental economics, macroeconomics, development economics, and the Indian economy is extensively published. And I'm delighted he will speak about a topic which is very central to the question we are facing. And that's the nature of voluntary provision of public goods, to the extent to which that poses a promising path, or what we have learned from the last 50 years or so of voluntary-based action. Professor Jha, would you like to take over the stage and move right into your agenda, please?
Thank you very much, Dr. Droege and Admiral Dhowan and Commodore Samadar for inviting me to this extremely important and important meeting, and for inviting me to speak at this event. So what I'm going to talk about today, I have about 15 minutes, you said, Dr. Droege? About 15 minutes? Okay. So what I'm going to talk about today, let me just see if I can share the screen. Can you see my screen? Can you see my screen? Okay, fine. Thank you.
Yes, very well. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about today is just a minute. Let me get it into slideshow. So one of the big challenges in public economics from the 1950s has been that of a voluntary provision of public goods. There are many areas of economics where public goods are very difficult to provide by the government or other central agency. And one of them, of course, is the sea. We have Dr. Dhowan has spoken eloquently of the problems that our oceans and seas face, and what the cost of inaction is, and the tragedy that the world economy, world society is facing because of the neglect of the oceans. So can we think of ways in which countries or groups of people or other groups can team together to voluntarily provide this important public good, which is the protection of the ocean. So the public good is protection of the ocean, and can we get our incentive mechanisms and our regulatory mechanisms to focus on providing this public good or correcting this public externality, public bad. So a key issue facing the design of the Global Maritime Accord is the provision of global public goods, or alleviating global public bads by reducing the rampant, unchecked use of the oceans as if they were a free good. Since nation states are responsible for their impact on the oceans only up to their exclusive economic zones, the use of resources in huge parts of the oceans is largely unchecked, as is the pollution of oceans, which Admiral Dhowan has already spelt out very eloquently. There's another point to this. It's not just the oceans which are of concern here, but something more. If you look at the current efforts to reduce carbon emission from the Earth, these efforts are requiring us to mine huge amounts of metals and minerals from the ground. And most of these are available, or large part, not most, but large parts of these come from very vulnerable islands. So, for example, if you look at look at all the Pacific developing countries, island developing countries, you will find a lot of the bauxite and the various other materials that you need for reducing carbon emissions in the world, for producing batteries and so on and so forth. They come from these islands. So the reduction of the global carbon problem is creating very specific carbon problems for these island states. So this is something which we should keep in mind, that the correction of the global externality can itself have some deleterious consequences. So we should keep that in mind, that the problem of addressing the challenge of global maritime pollution leads to the problem of very vulnerable states. So this lecture, I will not talk about the problems in the Pacific Island developing countries right now, because that's a very interesting and important argument in its own right. This lecture examines the incentives for voluntary provision of these public goods or alleviating the public bats. The actors responsible for the action would be nation states or private actors interested in the health of the oceans. The lecture will briefly survey the literature on this topic and advance some suggestions on how such voluntary provision may best be achieved. To the extent that voluntary provision needs to be supplemented by actions coordinated by nation states, this lecture will inquire into possible avenues for financing these activities. And finally, this lecture will conclude with policy recommendations and suggestions. So that is the structure of this lecture. So the first notion of the first concept, Paul Samuelson, the famous MIT economist, was the first person to advance the notion of a pure public good, whose consumption is non-rivalrous and inseparable. And this is a very well-known concept. But James Buchanan, in subsequent work, has distinguished between the availability of a public good and accessibility to the flows of services deriving from the public good. So the key result from Buchanan's study, or Buchanan's analysis, is that the ratio between the units of public goods produced and the stream of services of that good is changing. A relevant example is the distinction between oceans and availability of ocean resources. The ocean is the pure public good, but its linkage with resources is changing over time and over space. Another example is the fact that the provision of a new fire station, which is a public good, does not mean equal protection from the fire for all citizens in the vicinity. So Buchanan argues that an individual can express their preference for the public good, and these can be aggregated since these preferences are expressed in terms of the private good. Buchanan then develops the theory of clubs, which is a very famous theory of clubs. So groups of people or groups of nations, people groups within the club have preferential access to the public good, and there are barriers to entry. So some countries try to arrange themselves into a club, and they exclude other countries from entering the sphere of operation of their club, and try to maintain the health of the ocean, or to regulate the use of ocean resources in that manner. So one way of approaching the global public good of the oceans is to think in terms of the theory of clubs. How to define the optimal size of the club, how to determine the inter-club relationship. There are many such clubs in the world. How do they relate with each other? That is also a key question which needs to be studied. So a separate track towards addressing this kind of problem, voluntary provision, was initiated by the Nobel laureate Ronald Coase. He was interested in whether real institutions existed which were able to provide public goods. So a major example in the case of Ronald Coase was that of the lighthouse, which is very appropriate in this context. This requires a case of externality requiring public intervention. Everybody can see the lighthouse. The ships can approach the harbor without necessarily paying for the lighthouse's services. Coase asks whether ships can be forced to pay for lighthouse services. Possible to some extent, but it cannot be generalized. So this is the main result from Coase's study. More recently, Alan Peacock examined the role of technological changes. Peacock raises two challenges. One, devising mechanisms that embody and retain the characteristic of publicness. And two, justifying taxation rather than pricing as a method of financing the public good. So Ronald Coase was thinking in terms of putting a price on the house, on the services of the lighthouse. In his famous example, what he says was that as soon as ships enter the harbor, they are asked to pay a certain amount because it is assumed that they have utilized the services of the lighthouse. So that is the pricing mechanism, but then there is a taxation mechanism that can also be brought in here. For Peacock considers ways to transmit the past to future generations, also relevant in the case of oceans. For example, recognition of market failure may generate the phenomenon of the club to save a historical monument because they have a common interest in the historical period of activity and derive utility from preserving interest in it among the public at large. So there's a well-known monument which is not being cared for. So groups of people get together and try to preserve that monument through the club. Then after we have done that, then we use development of technology to expand the list of cases where this can be applied. So this is again a possible route to addressing the challenges faced by the depletion, by the poor treatment of the oceans. Consider an activity that produces an external effect. Suppose that through information dissemination, individuals realize this and attempt to take corrective action. They attempt to do this through direct provision of the public good. Perhaps the most prominent example of this is the provision of carbon offsets, which is happening on a large scale in the world economy today. Interest in purchasing carbon offsets is clearly on the rise, and participants in the market already include individuals, governments, and industry.
2 minutes.
Sorry?
We have maybe 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay, sorry, I'll be done in 2 or 3 minutes.
Thank you.
Cochin is another very important piece of work, shows that there are incentives for direct provision of the public good, and these incentives rise as the size of the economy increases. So there are some good theoretical results which we can build on to devise mechanisms for protecting the oceans. This is what I've been trying to suggest. Oops, where are we now? Okay. Sorry, Sorry, just a minute. I seem to have lost my. Anyway, so I seem to have lost my screen. I don't know, but I'll just say what I have in it. Yeah, here we go. So now we have to think of global public production as a last means. So I have discussed methods of addressing the challenge of repairing the oceans, and now we think in terms of global public production of this public good. We have looked at incentive mechanisms, and now we look at production. For example, we have satellite surveillance and regulation of the use of seabeds. And but when we go this route, when we take this route, we will have organizational and financial arrangements to take care of. Otherwise, we cannot. For example, if we are going to regulate the mining of the seabed, or we are going to have a clandestine operation which looks at people cheating or ships cheating when they are working in the oceans, then for all that we will need resources, quite a lot of resources, and an organizational structure which can guide them and ensure that they are fulfilling their purpose. So the next question then is how to finance such efforts. All right. So I have made some suggestions for that in a separate paper, which I don't want to talk about.
We're out of time almost. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this paper, which I had written for the G20 initiative for G20 initiative in India, which lays out 21 means through which resources can be raised in the world economy for financing such activity. So since I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman, I'll stop there, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I apologize for the limitations of time. We promised ourselves and everyone to stick within 6 minutes.
I'm sorry. No, I have to play by the rules. No issue at all.
Okay. Maybe you can unshare your screen and we will come back to you with
I'll unshare my screen.
And thank you also for pointing out the economic approach to this problem, which is of course focused on assets, on transactions, on monetary solutions to agendas which we all are familiar with. And I think it's very important to have that laid out so well by you, Dr. Jha. Of course, the challenge is that we're dealing with something a lot more comprehensive. And the next speaker will talk about the common heritage, the oceans as part of mankind's or humankind's common heritage. And it was a comprehensive sort of holistic view on what used to be thought of as the global commons as contradistinction to public goods, global public goods. We'll speak about that in following Dr. Egede's presentation on the common heritage of mankind, where he will talk about the question of a human-centric concept of international law being applicable here. He's a professor of international law and international relations at Cardiff University School of Law and Politics, and interestingly is currently a member of the Legal and Technical Commission of the International Seabed Authority and a member of the advisory board of the Brazilian Yearbook of the Law of the Sea, and one of the editors of the 6-volume book project on the law of the sea, contemporary norms and practice in Africa. Dr. Egede, please take it from here, and I will chime in when the clock approaches the limit. Thank you.
Yes, please, Peter, it will help if you could give me a notice of 5 minutes. You know, when you enjoy the topic so much, you end up talking so much.
All right, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Peter, for the invitation to give this talk. And Admiral Robin, thank you so much for this initiative, and Commando Sujat, thank you also. And good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are connecting from. What I'll be talking about today, I'm speaking as an international lawyer. I'll be looking in terms of the common heritage, and if I can pull up my screen, okay. Right. I just get the slideshow on, and then we'll take off. Okay, and I want to thank the previous speaker, Professor Jad. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'll be looking at it from, as I said, from an international law point of view. And I'll be looking at the common heritage of humankind under the Law of the Sea Convention, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. It's called the Common Heritage of Mankind, but generally people would now call it the Common Heritage of Humankind. And what I'm going to try and do, this is going to be the structure of the presentation. I have 15 minutes. I'll give an introduction to give us an idea of why this concept is so important, and why it is very important in terms of when we're thinking in terms of protection of the marine environment. Then I'll give an idea of what the UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, talks about in terms of the common heritage of humankind. I've put it as CHM because, as I said earlier on, under the treaty, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea is called the Common Heritage of Mankind. So I'll be using, the two interchangeably, so bear with me. And I'll talk briefly about the 1994 agreement because it effectively modified the UNCLOS. And then I'll try and give an idea of the context of some of the debates, because I'll be zeroing in more on deep seabed mining, because the common heritage of mankind, though it's used in terms of different global commons, the most developed in international law, international lawyers would argue that of the application of the common heritage of humankind is in relation to the deep seabed area. And the issue, the very big issue in terms of deep seabed mining, I'll try and give an idea of the context of the current debates, so we have an understanding of what the issues are. And then I'll zero in on some interesting takeaway points, I call it, of the common heritage of mankind as a human-centric concept. And then I'll try and give some conclusions to end. So let me start off by saying that when we think in terms of traditional international law of the sea, Admiral talked about it and gave us a good intro in terms of it. It's clearly a very key area. It's been an issue from way back. International law of the sea is one of the oldest areas of international law. And basically, when we think about how international law of the sea was developed, it was developed from a very state-centric approach. There are three key principles of the international law of the sea that we as international lawyers were talking about. The issue of sovereignty, when we talk about areas, for instance, in terms of the territorial sea, the coastal state will have sovereignty over the territorial sea. The coastal state will have sovereign rights over the exclusive economic zones and the continental shelf. So sovereignty is a big issue in the international law of the sea. And sovereignty was developed over the years to protect the interests of the coastal state. So we see it as a very state-centric approach. Then we go on to the high seas. I mean, like with the high seas, we talk about the freedom of the high seas. That's another key principle of the international law of the sea. And again, that was developed to protect the interests of states, because the developed states that had big naval ships were interested in having freedom to just go out there into the sea and do what they wanted to do. So again, we see that being developed as a very state-centric, issue. The common heritage of mankind or humankind, it's a more recent concept. It was basically, I mean, like the most popular development of it was as a result of a speech the then ambassador of Malta gave in terms of the deep sea bed below the high seas. And he made a very fascinating speech in 1967 saying that this part of the sea, this global common, should not be left to freedom of the seas, thinking only about the interest of states, but it should be declared as the common heritage of mankind or humankind. And we see in this concept an attempt to bring a human-centric approach to the whole idea of looking at the seas, that the seas is not only relevant to state actors, the seas is relevant to non-state actors, including you and I as part of humankind. So when he made that speech, he made some proposals in terms of it. And we'll see as we go on, this whole idea of the common heritage of mankind, some would say it's a concept, an individual concept, but others would say it incorporates quite a few things. And we'll look at some of these things as we go on. I wrote a book that was published in 2011 on this whole issue of the concept of common heritage of mankind. And we see sometimes it can be quite nebulous in terms of it, and trying to interpret it in a very concise way might be a bit complicated. But what we can see is that we can discern some common characteristics from this whole concept of the common heritage of mankind. Avipado, when he talked about it in 1967, talked about the fact that we must have an independent institution that basically manages this regime, this new regime that we're talking about. And currently we would see that under the UNCLOS as the International Seabed Authority that is given the role under the convention to manage activities in the deep seabed area, mineral-related activities. The UNCLOS Part 11 deals with mineral-related activities, and that's why we had to have the whole idea of the High Seas Treaty that has basically been adopted. Admiral referred to it, and the idea is obviously to try and get it ratified. The High Seas Treaty is an implementation agreement of the UNCLOS. So it's meant to work along with the UNCLOS. So an effective institution developed. He talked about the fact that we need to recognize that this global common should not belong to anyone, but should be basically owned by everyone or managed by everyone. And it should be used exclusively for peaceful uses. And then there was the issue of equitable sharing of benefits, giving preferable considerations to developing poorer states. The idea is to try and see if there's a way that there can be sustainable development in that part of the sea, and whatever is got from it would be used for, basically developing states, but hopefully trickling down to help the citizens of the state. And also it talked about freedom of marine scientific research, because there's so much to know in terms of that part of the sea that we don't know. And the idea is that there should be cooperation in terms of that. And then this is very critical. He stressed on the fact that protection and preservation of the environment is a key part of this. We cannot neglect that, because there's no point going into the, going in and finding out that there's so much that is cost, in terms of damage to the marine environment. So basically this was incorporated into the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. and it's usually called the Constitution of the Oceans. And basically, quite a lot of what was proposed by Admiral was incorporated in. The deep seabed area was carved out as part of the maritime zones that will be interested in. The resources that basically there's interests in, or there was interest in at that time, was in terms of mineral-related resources. And basically it's been declared as the common heritage of mankind. The
3
idea,
minutes.
yeah, sorry? 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
And you didn't give me a chance for the 5-minute chance, so this is a 3 minute.
3 minutes. Okay, fine. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
So we see that even right now, there's a lot of debate in terms of it, and we need to. The GMA, if we're going to be effective in contributing to the debate, we need to understand the nature of the debate. And the debate basically has 3 aspects to it. The first is the aspect of proponents of deep seabed mining. The whole idea is that we have some very interesting minerals that will be relevant in terms of the transition to a low carbon economy. That if we're going to be thinking about solar energy, solar panels that we'll need for that, electric cars, the batteries we'll need for that, mobile phones, then we need to be able to access even the deep sea bed to get some of these minerals from there. The idea is that from some of the researches that have been done, they claim that there's not enough in terms of production, in terms of the land territory to deal with that. And even if we encourage more production in the land, territory in terms of that, that would encourage more even impact, negative impact in terms of the environment in the terrestrial part of the world. So that's one part of the argument. The second proponents are saying, well, we don't know too much about what's happening in terms of the deep seabed area. And there's a danger that going in there to mine it without having that knowledge will create massive marine environmental problems, irreversible damage to the marine environment. And the idea is that we should have a moratorium or a precautionary pause. The idea of this is basically to halt the whole process of commercial exploitation of the deep seabed area until we have enough knowledge about its impact on the marine environment. So that's the second view. We need to find out more before we go in. The third view is that there should be a total ban in terms of deep seabed mining, and we should just throw away the convention. And this is problematic from an international law point of view because the UNCLOS was developed as a package deal. So if there's that total ban, that will be completely contrary to the treaty provisions, and it will completely unravel the treaty and have a huge impact in the current treaty, high seas treaties, if we go that route. So that's the key point. So to mention the takeaways because of time, in terms of the common heritage of mankind, this concept is really important if we're going to promote basically the issue of protecting the marine environment, because the idea of the common heritage of mankind is to have as a critical part Article 145 of the UNCLOS is the idea of protecting the environment. And this is all tied up with the fact that we're looking at this from a human-centric point of view. Clearly, if there are irreversible harm and damage to the environment, that would have impact in terms of the seas. As the seas, it will have impact in terms of fishing and different areas, and it will have a completely negative impact in terms of the whole idea of human beings and protecting the environment. So we see that the primary focus of the CHM is mankind. We're thinking in terms of mankind. And if we're thinking about that, profit in terms of the idea of making profit should not be the primary goal of engaging with this regime. It should be, how does this benefit mankind in terms of this issue? Secondly, we see the issue of equity. The UNCLOS has provisions in terms of that. Equity in terms of intragenerational equity. And that's why we see there's an emphasis in terms of developing states having a preferential rights in terms of that, in terms of research, if eventually there's exploitation in terms of the resources. And the idea is for it to trickle down to individuals. And then also thinking beyond the current generation, intergenerational equity. Whatever we do, we have to start to think ahead. How will it impact even the future generation? And then we also have the issue that we have to recognize, because this is the common heritage of humankind, that there are shared assets that we're thinking about. Not only the mineral resources, there are other assets. The environment, for instance, we can regard as a shared asset. So we need to be careful in terms of how we handle this vis-a-vis the environment. Also, the whole idea of the knowledge-based asset. There's so much we need to know about the deep seabed area. So it's important that we try and share even this so that all mankind, wherever they are, will benefit from it. Then finally, before I conclude, we see that what is happening, because we're talking about the common heritage of mankind. The idea is to ensure that we're trying to hear the voice of the different mankind or humankind, and the idea is to try and involve as many stakeholders as possible in terms of this discussion. Right now, obviously, we have states that, go to the International Seabed Authority to make their views heard, but we also have members of the civil societies. They have observer status, and their voice is very strong in the International Seabed Authority, giving their views about why there should be a precautionary pause or a ban in terms of deep seabed mining. So there's provision for that. And also what happens is that in terms of developing the regulations for the regime, including currently the exploitation regulation, there's an attempt to involve other stakeholders through stakeholder surveys, through the use of social media platform, through consultations with consultants and experts who are involved. So the idea is to try and develop that a bit more. So in conclusion, I think what we need to be thinking about in terms of it is first, obviously, understanding the current position of international law in relation to the deep seabed area, deep seabed mining, to understand that the issue of protecting the environment is central to the UNCLOS. And the idea is obviously to understand why the principle applicable is the common heritage of humankind, and also trying to find out how the GMA can actually use even some of the current platforms to express their views in terms of the deep seabed mining area and what is happening. My take in terms of this, and this will be the final point, is that the only time we can effectively make a contribution is when we understand the various arguments concerning it. We have a database concerning the various research that has been done about this, and we're able to make a valid contribution, whether contradicting the existing research, but it's evidence-based, and we can actually contribute by actually being involved in terms of the International Seabed Authority. One of the ways is by applying to be an observer so that we can come in. Various civil societies are already doing that, and make our views heard at the International Seabed Authority so that state parties can understand the issues, and some state parties might just buy into it. Thank you very much, Peter. Sorry, I've taken a few minutes above. I'll be happy to take questions even when we're taking the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Egede. Edwin, that's a wonderful compliment to what Professor Jha expounded on. And in a way, it was quite complementary, because if I may challenge you both, you can think about this question, is the following. If you're really interested in a human-centric approach, a common heritage, would we not want to be focusing on an ocean-centric approach? Because humanity is so much talked about. It's talking about the oceans as an asset. Yeah, a common asset, but still an asset to be mined and explored. And the question is, how sustainably can that be done? But fundamentally, our economic theory is focused on the centricity of our own interests, and it completely disregards the interests, so to speak, of the biosphere or the inhabitants of the biosphere. Those other gigatons of biomass that isn't voting, so to speak. And what can we do to move the needle forward on that debate and include the oceans and make the oceans to be the centric of the interested party here? And maybe it's appropriate if I call a professor of comparative criminology to comment on this, or whatever he would like to comment on. He's an associate professor of international comparative criminal law, Asian African law, gender and human rights. And Arinori Kawamura from Nagasaki, you're speaking from a center that's dedicated to planetary health. What about the rights of the oceans? Is there a ocean-focused criminal law that we should have? Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to such an interesting seminar. Nice to meet you, professors. My name is Arinori Kawamura. I am an associate professor of a graduate school and the School of Global Humanities and Social Sciences at Nagasaki University. I specialize in criminal law and criminal procedure, but I was working in Japan Coast Guard Academy for 13 years. And so I have been still working with the 5 legal law professors specializing in criminal law, criminal procedural law, and international maritime law, respectively, on contemporary issues of maritime control and legislation. And today, Professor Egede's wonderful presentations, I have 2 comments. One is, I believe it is very important for each country to make the UNCLOS principles governing the area international law. I would therefore like to ask Professor Egede whether there are any progressive countries in the international community that have made the principles governing the area national law in one of their countries. And the second point, it is very important that the area is positioned as a common heritage of mankind and the global environment as a global common. However, according to the definition in the convention, the resources to be regulated and managed are limited to mineral resources. And the authority is also limited to the management, exploration, and exploitation of mineral rights. Some critics argue that it does not apply to biogenetic resources or even to biological resources in general. What are your views on the legal vacuum regarding marine biogenetic resources? That is my second point. Thank you very much. Professor Droege is okay?
Thank you very much. That's
right.
excellent.
Do I respond now or just wait? Yeah.
I think what we'd like to do is perhaps gather this question, keep it in your mind, answer it, and if Raghbendra has a comment on that too as well. And I invite Chennai Sai University's Garima Singh for her question, equally short and precise, concise, and then if the presenters could respond. Thank you. Keep it short, Garima. You need to turn on the microphone. Or maybe you don't have a microphone. But you did write a question. One is, most of the laws apply to the high seas. What could be done about the exploitation by the countries in their own territories? That's one question you raised. The other question you raised is to Professor Jha. I'd like to have your views on this problem of equality and equity in the sharing of resources, where there's a debate on sharing the resources with regard to the contribution made by countries, or should the sharing be done on the basic basis of needs? So perhaps to you, Professor Egede, if you could respond to Professor Kawamura's question first, and then move to Garima Singh's question. Karima, we can't hear you. Please use the chat.
All right.
Go
Thank
ahead,
you very much,
Edwin.
Peter. Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Karamura. Thank you for the very interesting questions. The first question, if I'm correct, I have here is talking about international law. Each country, are there progressive countries involved in terms of the issue of deep seabed mining? And progressive, I assume, in the sense of perhaps taking the view that deep seabed mining might not be the way to go at that time, at this point in time. Yes, there are quite a few, because what you have in the International Seabed Authority is that all parties to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea are part of the assembly, and quite a number of them are part of the council. Those are different arms of the International Seabed Authority. So you have, with the assembly, you have about 169 state parties. And all states basically are allowed to express their views. There are quite a number of states in the assembly who take the view that there should be a moratorium or a precautionary pause. There are some who are leaning towards in terms of, should we start to explore that? There are quite a number who are very concerned in terms of protecting the environment. And that's why, because that's one of the key mandates of the International Seabed Authority under the convention. That's why there can be no commercial exploitation until the issue of protecting the environment is sorted out. Because one of the key things about the convention is that there shouldn't be any irreversible or serious harm to the environment by reason of exploitation activity. So in short, in response to your question, yes, there are states within the ISA that would fit into that categorization of progressive state. And quite a number of them are actually also heavily influenced in terms of their view by the viewpoints of civil society. Those who come in as observers, basically are able to actually speak during the discussions, during the council and the assembly. And sometimes by putting across their view, some of the states obviously buy in, and they develop their policies based on that. Well, the other question, deep seabed mining, you're absolutely correct. The current regime under the UNCLOS gives the International Seabed Authority the mandate over purely mineral resources in the area. And that's the whole idea. That's why the whole negotiation of the High Seas Treaty had to take place, because there was that lacuna in terms of international law. And so what the High Seas Treaty deals with is the issue of conservation and sustainable use of marine genetic resources, for instance. And right now, fortunately, it has been successfully adopted. But as Admiral mentioned at the onset, the big issue now is to take it from there, because with international law, adoption is just a stage. The key thing is to get the number of states to ratify it so it can come to force. So that's what is being dealt with even right now.
Thank you.
And hopefully that will be sorted out soon. Then going to Garima's question, Garima Singh, thank you very much. The thing about the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, as I said, it's called the Constitution of the Oceans. The idea of this convention is that it deals holistically with the issues on the law of the sea. So it deals with the different maritime zones. And it not only deals with the global commons, like the deep seabed area, it deals with things within national jurisdiction. Like it talks about territorial sea, it talks about exclusive economic zone and continental shelf. And when we look at it, there's a strong input of the convention in terms of protecting the marine environment. And that's the responsibility of coastal states. But the good thing about the convention is that it makes provision from time to time for the state parties to agree amongst themselves to adopt what we call an implementation agreement. If there's a feeling that things need to be put in more details, they come together and negotiate an implementation agreement, and they try and amplify the convention. So in response to your question, there's provision for that, and there's provision to further amplify if the state parties agree. And then, Peter, if I have the time, I'll just respond quickly to your question, because that's a very interesting one. And I know there are discussions even right now, even under international law, about, well, the idea that we shouldn't just focus on the rights of human beings, but also we should focus on the rights of nature. And that's obviously a very interesting debate. But some would argue that in reality, when we talk about the rights of nature, obviously nature has to depend on people to promote what they feel that is the right of nature. And at the end of the day, what you will still have is that people will be putting forward their value understanding of what those rights should be. So in response to your question, yes, there's a growing move in terms of looking at the rights of nature. And so some would say, yes, we can look at the rights of the sea as distinct from the rights of human beings. But others would say, well, the bottom line is that if we have people who are arguing for the rights of the sea, at the end of the day, they're going to be putting forward what they understand to be the rights of the sea. And in the long run, some would argue that in reality, they're still talking about the rights of humans, So it's a very valid point you've raised, and it's something that it's been discussed.
Let me just pick you up on that. I think that's been a wonderful discourse, and we are unfortunately out of time. And just looking at Professor Jha's window and see whether he'd like to respond to anything, but very quickly.
Yes.
After Professor Jha, may I just have 30 seconds to just make two comments?
We want just a second. I think absolutely we'll wrap it up like that. I also would like to refer to many very important questions in the chat, very intelligent questions like what happens to countries that are not part of the UNCLOS agreements, or countries that are part of the UNCLOS agreement but also rampantly exploit resources outside of the law of the sea and violate it. How can we deal with that? And there are several other questions which we'll be saving and sending to you, Edwin and Raghbendra. If you could give short answers, we can publish them as a follow-up on our website.
Sure.
But let me just quickly answer that the dichotomy between nature and humans is part of the common flaw that we see now. If we live this dichotomy, our own existential future is at threat. And I think the existential threat, the immediate threat, which is akin to somebody attacking you in a dark alley with a gun, it's as immediate as that, is not being dealt with in these discussions. And I think that's what a lot of young people respond to now, that the legal framework and the discourse of the law and policy making is framed around a different time when things were stable, when we did have a rich nature to relate to, some common sense of the future. But now we see by not living the missing dichotomy, we are part of nature, we are nature, the nature is us, we are missing a little bit the point of a new sort of perspective on all these very important legal frameworks that have to do with the right to live. In other words, our own right to an existential future. Raghbendra, 30.5 seconds for you, and then Admiral will chime in with his final view on the session. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Peter. And thank you everyone for your kind comments and questions. They are very illuminating. My main point really is to lay down the fact that we can have two alternative approaches to this issue of the Global Maritime Accord. One is going the legislative route, which Dr. Egede has expounded so eloquently. And the other is to recognize that not much has happened in the legislative route, in the command and control route. We have so many different good ideas for the preservation of nature, for human rights, for protection of children, and so on and so forth. And I don't think we have made much progress in any of those areas. Or at least in most of those areas. So we can spend quite a lot of time discussing that, and we should. And we should try to look at the legislative approach. But then the other approach is to try to understand what is possible. And this is what is possible under the circumstances. Can people be made to cooperate with each other? What is the incentive structure which will make them cooperate with each other? Countries be made to cooperate with each other? These are two alternative narratives of the problem, and I think that we need to spend our energies and our understanding of these two things, both of them, and to hopefully make some progress in protecting the oceans. Okay, so let me stop there. That's more than 30.5 seconds, but I'll stop there.
But this is a very important, valid point, the cooperative focus, because clearly we need to work together to confront this common threat, which has to do with individual threats to the ocean, but fundamentally it's the entirety of the conditions we need to face together, and how to establish that sense of we and what legal frameworks can do, or the discourse around legal frameworks is going to be a common thread, so to speak, through all of our events that are still coming up, and that we will also share with you, as we will share with you record of this meeting. Robin Dhowan, Admiral, take charge.
Thank you very much, Peter. 30 seconds. And here I'd like to very quickly thank Professor Jar and Dr. Edwin for very enriching presentations. Now, taking on 2 points. The first point is that good intentions and legislation without any significant monitoring and having the wherewithal to implement or enforce is not going to get us anywhere. We have seen what freedom of the seas has led to. So, as part of the High Seas Treaty and more as part of the action plan for the Global Maritime Accord, we will have to come up with specific suggestions and recommendations as to how the global commons or the areas beyond national jurisdiction need to be first carried out in terms of marine spatial planning, demarcate out the marine protected areas, thereafter leverage technology, if need be space-based technology, to monitor, and then maritime cooperation by countries of the world to thereafter implement and enforce if required the rules that are laid out. First point. The second point is when we come to the common heritage of mankind, I totally agree with what Dr. Peter has mentioned, that we need to start looking at this from the view of the oceans. And the Global Maritime Accord is a petition of the oceans. We cannot hide under the fact and say that it is for good of humankind, good of mankind. That has led us nowhere. We have plundered the ocean. Deep seabed mining needs to be looked at the point of view that, yes, if you want to extract something like polymetallic nodules and cobalt from the oceans for humankind need, what are you going to do to ensure that it is with minimum impact on the environment and it is part of the sustainable development? And we will have to look at the point of view is that what do the oceans want? We cannot hide under the garb that it's only humans which are important. Your earth is important, your oceans are important. So I think these two important points will have to be looked at when we are looking at our drafting of the Global Maritime Accord. But very, very valid points made both by Dr. Edwin as well as Professor Jha and by you, Peter. Thank you very much, and to all our participants.
It's a challenge to all of us to take the content of today's presentations and discussions and answer the question in our own mind, but also collectively and in notes to each other. What does it mean in terms of changing practice, implementing change, inside or outside the legal boundaries we've set ourselves, and inside and outside of the discursive frame that is still restricting us in our past practices? Thank you, Raghbendra, for that point. Thank you, Edwin, Admiral, Commodore, Garima, and Arinori, and everyone in the audience. We'll see you soon at the third installment of the GMA Academy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.